A single stone at the center of Stonehenge just rewrote everything we thought we knew about ancient Britain. And it did not come from where anyone expected. For over 100 years, scientists were certain this stone came from Wales, sitting quietly a few hundred miles from Salisbury Plain. Then researchers ran a new round of mineral analysis on it, and the results made them stop and recheck their work twice, because the data was pointing somewhere that made no geological sense at first glance. Scotland. Not just Scotland in a loose, general way, but a very specific patch of coastline more than 700 kilometers away, near the very tip of the northeast coast. If that number sounds unremarkable, sit with it for a second, because we're talking about a 6-ton slab of rock, moved across the length of an entire island, roughly 5,000 years ago, by people we used to describe with words like primitive and simple. That single discovery is the reason this video exists, and it is only the beginning of what modern scanning and analysis have found hiding inside the most famous prehistoric monument on Earth. Stonehenge sits on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, about 80 miles southwest of London, and it has been standing there, in one form or another, for around 5,000 years. Generations of visitors have walked around its ring of towering sarsen stones and its inner horseshoe of smaller bluestones, and for just as long. 3 questions have refused to go away. Where did the stones actually come from? How were people without metal tools, wheeled carts, or any written system able to move and shape them? And why, out of every possible location in Britain, did the builders choose this particular stretch of chalk grassland to do it? For centuries, the honest answer to all 3 was some version of "we're not entirely sure." That has started to change, not because of a single sensational leak or a viral claim, but because of a decade of patient, unglamorous scientific work: geochemical fingerprinting, high-resolution laser scanning, acoustic modeling, and careful digital reconstruction. Much of it now assisted by machine learning that can spot patterns across thousands of data points faster than any human eye. Let's start with the easier mystery, the one that got solved first: the giant sarsen stones, the ones that make up the tall outer circle and the central horseshoe, some standing over 7 meters high and weighing as much as 25 tons. For 400 years, people speculated about where these monsters had been quarried. The leading guess was somewhere on the Marlborough Downs, a region of open chalk hills about 20 miles north of the site, but nobody had proof. In 2020, a team led by geomorphologist Professor David Nash finally cracked it, and the tool that made it possible was almost accidental. Back in the 1950s, when conservation crews repaired one of the stones, known as Stone 58, they drilled a cylindrical core out of it and kept it as a curiosity. That core eventually made its way back to England from the United States, where an employee who had worked on the original repair had kept it as a souvenir. Nash's team used portable X-ray fluorescence to test the chemical signature of every remaining sarsen at the site, then compared that signature against sarsen outcrops scattered across southern England and against the returned core, using more advanced lab techniques like mass spectrometry to nail down the details. The match came back clean. West Woods, a wooded stretch on the edge of the Marlborough Downs, just over 15 miles from Stonehenge. 50 of the 52 sarsens tested shared this same chemical fingerprint, meaning the builders were not grabbing whatever large rock happened to be nearby. They were selecting from one specific area, likely because it offered the largest, most workable stones within a reasonable hauling distance. As one of the researchers put it, this settled over 300 years of argument in a single study. That would have been a satisfying enough ending on its own. But 4 years later came the discovery that actually shook the archaeological world, and it involves the stone lying flat at the very center of Stonehenge, known as the altar stone. For more than a century, everyone assumed the altar stone belonged to the same family as the bluestones, the smaller monoliths transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, about 150 miles away. It seemed logical. Similar size class, similar general region, similar rough time period of arrival. Then in 2024, a research team led by Anthony Clark at Curtin University in Australia took a much closer look at the mineral grains locked inside fragments of the altar stone, fragments that had actually been sitting in museum collections since digs in the 1840s. Rather than looking at the whole rock chemistry, they dated individual zircon, apatite, and rutile grains within the sandstone, tiny time capsules that record where and when the parent rock originally formed. The pattern of ages did not match Wales at all. It matched a rock formation called the Old Red Sandstone, specifically the version found in the Arcadian Basin of northeast Scotland, a region that stretches up toward Orkney. Later follow-up work clarified that the source was not the main island of Orkney itself, but somewhere in that broader Arcadian geological zone along the Scottish coast. Published in the journal Nature, the study forced scientists to accept something almost unbelievable. A 6-ton block of stone had traveled at least 750 kilometers, the equivalent of walking from London to well past Edinburgh and back partway again, to end up at the symbolic heart of this monument. Naturally, the next question is how. And here the honest scientific answer is refreshingly less dramatic than you might expect, but arguably more impressive, because it points to real human ingenuity rather than any borrowed or lost technology. Researchers have run detailed ice flow reconstructions to check whether ancient glaciers might have dragged the stone partway there on their own, sparing humans some of the journey. The modeling says this is unlikely. Glacial movement patterns from Scotland during the last ice age mostly pushed material northeast, away from Wiltshire, not toward it. And while some ice streams did travel southeast as far as what is now the submerged Dogger Bank area of the North Sea, there is no clean glacial pathway connecting northeast Scotland to Salisbury Plain. That leaves human transport as the most credible explanation, whether over land, by coastal boat routes, or some combination of both. And that in turn tells us something remarkable about late Neolithic Britain. This was not a patchwork of isolated, disconnected farming communities. People, materials, and presumably ideas were moving across the length of the island, which lines up with other evidence archaeologists have found, like shared pottery styles and house designs appearing simultaneously in far-flung regions, and even chemical signatures in livestock bones, suggesting some animals eaten near Stonehenge had themselves been raised in Scotland. Some researchers now argue that Stonehenge itself may have functioned as a kind of unifying project, a shared undertaking that stitched together far-flung Neolithic communities around a common purpose, with stones deliberately gathered from the far corners of Britain as a symbolic act of connection rather than pure practicality. Now let's talk about how modern technology actually lets us see all of this in the first place, because the story of Stonehenge research over the last 15 years is really a story about instruments getting good enough to ask new questions. English Heritage and partner researchers carried out one of the most detailed surveys ever attempted on the monument, using ground-based laser scanning to capture the surface of every stone down to a resolution of 0.5 millimeter. That data set, still one of the most complete digital records of any prehistoric monument in the world, allows researchers to examine tool marks, weathering patterns, and surface irregularities without touching the stones at all, and to compare erosion and carving styles across different stones to build a clearer picture of which parts of the monument were built first and which were added or reworked over the following centuries. Photogrammetry, which builds three-dimensional models from overlapping photographs, and ground-penetrating radar, which reveals buried features without any digging, have added further layers to this picture, mapping pits, post holes, and features around the monument that are invisible from the surface. Machine learning models are increasingly used to process this flood of scanned data, sorting through thousands of surface measurements to flag patterns a human researcher might take months to notice by eye, essentially acting as a very fast, very patient research assistant rather than some mysterious oracle. It is worth being clear about what this technology does and does not do. It does not detect hidden pyramids, secret chambers of lost wisdom, or evidence of vanished supercivilizations. What it does is let archaeologists ask sharper versions of ordinary questions and get more precise answers, faster than traditional field work alone ever could. That same digital survey work has also let researchers place Stonehenge back into its wider setting rather than treating it as an isolated ring of stones sitting alone in a field. Salisbury Plain around the monument is dotted with earlier and later features, ditches, burial mounds, and the massive circular enclosure a couple of miles away at Dunnington Walls, once a substantial settlement that may have housed the workforce building Stonehenge itself. Aerial photography, geophysical survey, and ground-penetrating radar carried out over the past 2 decades, including a major mapping project led by the University of Birmingham, revealed that this landscape was far busier than a single monument suggests, with clusters of pits, processional pathways, and smaller stone or timber circles connecting the sites to one another. None of this needs an exotic explanation to be impressive. It simply shows that Stonehenge was the centerpiece of a much larger, actively used ceremonial landscape, built and rebuilt by real communities over a very long stretch of time, rather than a single mysterious structure dropped in isolation. One of the more fascinating threads this scanning work has fed into is the study of Stonehenge's acoustics. A research team from the University of Salford, working with archaeologists including Rupert Till, built a precise scale model of Stonehenge as it would have looked with all its stones standing, based on detailed archaeological survey data, and tested how sound actually behaved inside that reconstructed space. Their findings suggested that a complete stone circle would have created a noticeably different acoustic environment from the partial ruins standing today, one that could support and slightly reinforce sound for people standing or performing within the circle, somewhat similar in principle to the way any enclosed circular space affects how sound travels and reflects, though nowhere near as dramatic as a concert hall. This is genuinely interesting, because it suggests the builders may have experienced Stonehenge as more than a purely visual monument, but the responsible way to describe it is as a real acoustic effect worth studying, not proof of some hidden supernatural sound engineering system beamed in from a lost science. Extraordinary claims deserve careful, patient testing, and that testing is exactly what's happening, slowly and rigorously, rather than through a single dramatic reveal. While the Sarsens and the altar stone were grabbing headlines, a separate branch of research had already spent over a decade tracking down the exact origin of the smaller bluestones, and that story deserves its own moment, because it may be the most physically demonstrated feat of the entire monument. Geologists first linked these stones to the prehistoric hills in southwest Wales back in the 1920s, using basic mineral comparison, but it took modern fieldwork, led by geologist Richard Bevins and archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson, to actually locate the specific quarry outcrops the stones were cut from. Excavations at two sites in the Prehistoric Hills, known as Craig Rosewyfelin and Carn Godog, uncovered stone tool marks, wedge-shaped extraction points, and even the remains of a loading platform, physical evidence that Neolithic people were deliberately levering blocks of rock away from the outcrop face, rather than simply collecting loose stones that had already broken off naturally. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal and burnt hazelnut shells found at these quarry sites see logistical feats of Neolithic Britain, backed not by speculation, but by tool marks people can still run their fingers over today. The construction story itself, once you strip away the myth-making, is arguably more impressive than any embellished version. Experimental archaeology projects, including a well-documented sledge and log track trial run by a Bulgarian team studying megalith transport, have shown that a coordinated group of people using timber sledges, log rails, and rope can move stones weighing many tons across level or gently sloping ground at a slow but entirely achievable pace. It takes planning, teamwork, rest cycles, and almost certainly seasonal timing tied to harvests and available labor, but it does not require anything beyond Neolithic technology and organized human cooperation. Radiocarbon dating, run independently by multiple labs over decades and consistently cross-checked, places the main construction phases of Stonehenge between roughly 2500 and 2000 BCE, with earlier phases involving the circular ditch and bank, known as the henge, and the ring of pits called the Aubrey Holes, dating back even further, to around 3000 BC. Far from being a mystery that undermines the radiocarbon record, the layered construction history actually matches it well. This was a monument built, modified, and reused over roughly 1500 years, likely by many successive generations who each added their own touches, rather than a single generation completing a finished design in one go. So, if it wasn't left behind by some vanished advanced civilization, what was Stonehenge actually for? Archaeologists are honest that we don't have a single, fully agreed answer, and that's not a cop-out. It's the accurate scientific position. The strongest, best-supported theory ties Stonehenge to the summer and winter solstices. The monument's main axis lines up with the sunrise on the longest day of the year and, in the opposite direction, the sunset on the shortest day, an alignment too precise and too consistently referenced by other nearby Neolithic monuments to be coincidence. Excavations at the nearby settlement of Dangton Walls uncovered evidence of massive seasonal feasting, with pig bones showing that animals were slaughtered at an age suggesting a midwinter gathering, pointing towards Stonehenge functioning as the ceremonial endpoint of a broader ritual landscape used for community gatherings tied to the turning of the seasons. There is also substantial evidence that Stonehenge served as a burial site, particularly in its earlier phases. Cremated human remains have been recovered from the area around the Aubrey Holes, suggesting the monument had a role connected to honoring the dead, quite possibly serving as a memorial ground for people from communities across the region, which would help explain why materials were brought from so far away. The stones themselves may have carried personal or ancestral significance for the people who transported them. Isotope analysis of teeth from some of these individuals has even suggested that not everyone buried near Stonehenge grew up locally, hinting that the monument drew people, and perhaps their remains, from well beyond Wiltshire, reinforcing the idea of a site with reach far wider than its immediate surroundings. At Dangton Walls, excavation teams have recovered enormous quantities of pig bone, animal remains showing signs of feasting on a scale far beyond what a single small community would need, alongside houses arranged along what may have been a processional path leading toward the River Avon and, eventually, Stonehenge itself. Studies of the pig's teeth indicate many were slaughtered at roughly 9 months old, a detail that lines up neatly with animals born in spring being killed the following winter, pointing toward large midwinter gatherings rather than random, spread-out slaughter throughout the year. Put together, the solstice alignment, the burial evidence, and the feasting evidence at Dangton Walls paint a coherent, evidence-backed picture, a monument used across generations for seasonal ceremony, for honoring the dead, and quite possibly for bringing together communities from across Britain at key moments in the yearly calendar, all without requiring a single invented claim about vanished technology. Here is what should actually leave you a little in awe, without needing any invented mystery layered on top. Around 5,000 years ago, communities without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles for long-distance haulage, and without any writing system organized themselves well enough to quarry stones from west woods just up the road, and separately arranged for a completely different, much heavier stone to be brought the length of Britain from the Scottish coast, all to be assembled with intentional astronomical alignment on a plane in Wiltshire, and then maintained and modified by their descendants for the next millennium and a half. That is not a story about lost ancient technology. It's a story about the very real, very human capacity for long-term planning, large-scale cooperation, and long-distance connection, achieved with nothing more than timber, rope muscle, and time. Modern instruments, from laser scanners, capturing tool marks 0.5 millimeter wide to mineral dating techniques that can trace a single grain of sand back to the coast it eroded from, haven't discovered a hidden conspiracy. They've simply given us a sharper lens on how genuinely capable our Neolithic ancestors were. There is still plenty we don't know, and that is exactly why research at Stonehenge hasn't stopped. Less than 1/10 of the wider surrounding landscape has been fully excavated, out of respect for its status as a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site, and every improvement in scanning resolution or dating precision tends to open new, more specific questions rather than closing old ones. Exactly how the altar stone made its 750-kilometer journey, whether by an overland route, along the coast by boat, or some mixture of both, is still an open and actively studied problem. That, honestly, is what makes real archaeology so compelling. Not manufactured shock, but a genuine, ongoing mystery being chipped away at, one careful measurement at a time, by people determined to let the evidence speak for itself rather than deciding the answer in advance. So the comments which mystery you want us to dig into next, and subscribe for more real, evidence-based deep dives into the ancient world.